The 2-week expiration of the ceasefire agreed to by the United States and Iran comes tomorrow. Negotiators from the United States are headed to Islamabad. It's unclear yet whether the Iranians will join them. So on today's live stream, we're going to talk about the latest on the moves toward final negotiations, toward perhaps an extension or perhaps the resumption of hostility. Is going to be joined by my colleague, Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, earlier this morning, interviewed Hassan Ahmadi, a University of Tehran professor, on the state of play, and we're going to play extended clips from that interview and discuss them. Also this morning, President Donald Trump did at least a 40-minute phone interview with CNBC and touched, significantly on his relationship with the Gulf states, how the Gulf states are feeling about the war, his position, his current position on the negotiations, which may change by the end of this live stream. So joining me now is my colleague Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, how are you doing?
Whiplash, man. This has been a very intense few days.
Yes, and so you and Murtaza Hussain reported on Sunday that while the Western press was suggesting that the Iranians were kind of eager to get back to Islamabad, that they in fact had not yet agreed to do so, and were had kind of side plans if talks fell apart or did not come together to renew the war with renewed vigor. Before we get to Trump and his CNBC interview, and I'll play some clips and get your reaction to them, what is your sense of how things have evolved over the past few days?
Yeah, I mean, on Friday, it did seem as though there was going to be some sort of a breakthrough, because you had the foreign minister of Iran, Abbas Araghchi, posting on Twitter that the Strait of Hormuz was going to be open again to commercial traffic. And what I'm told by Iranian officials is that this wasn't just, Araghchi, the foreign minister, deciding to post this kind of, freelance, but that there had been an agreement between the United States and Iran of kind of a TikTok of how this would unfold, that Araghchi would post that. Trump would then post something affirming it, which Trump did, in fact. And in his post on Truth Social, Trump actually called it the Strait of Iran, and he thanked Iran for that. And then, clearly something happened in between, whether it was Israel intervening or others within the White House or Trump watching how everything unfolded on social media. Then he started to just go, bonkers, erratic, and revert back to, lunacy. And he starts saying, oh no, our military blockade is going to, remain in place. And then that culminates with U.S. forces shooting the engine room of an Iranian vessel and then seizing the vessel and posting video of that. The Iranians then said, well, we're reverting back to our previous position, and that, what had been announced, the United States violated by reimposing or keeping this blockade and by shooting at this Iranian vessel. And so then it deteriorated from there over the weekend on one level. On another level, there's then these reports, J.D. Vance is imminently going to be landing in Islamabad. And certainly the Pakistanis have been in the middle of a huge security operation, clearing large swaths of the area around the hotel where we believe another round of talks will be held if the Iranians decide to go forward. But what's clear is that, as we've reported for many weeks, it's been the United States that has been desperate for an off-ramp and to have talks with the Iranians. And it's not the other way around. It's not that the Iranians have been begging Trump. And the evidence of that is just as plain to see right now, with Trump once again going back to saying he's going to bomb their civilization, that if Iran doesn't make a deal with Trump, according to his ultimatums, that he's going to bomb every bridge, he's going to bomb their power stations. And so while the Western press over the weekend was reporting that these talks were going to be happening, we spoke to a senior Iranian official who said, we had an agreement, and this is actually a bit of news here, Ryan. They said we had an agreement that there was not going to be any of these threats as we started to work out the details of a second round, and that this had been communicated directly to Vice President J.D. Vance when they sat across the table, the United States and Iran, that there wouldn't be these kinds of threats from Trump during this period. And Trump just couldn't help himself. And so what happened then is that there's been a standoff over the issue of what's going to happen in the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians have said two things. One is they recognize the Israelis are violating the 10-day agreed upon so-called ceasefire in Lebanon. And the other is that the U.S. continues to maintain this military blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians have said that in order for talks to go forward, there has to be some movement on that front. I think they want an entire end to the U.S. military blockade. I'm not sure what their bottom line would be. But the last I spoke to Iranian officials, they said that they're not going to be commenting right now on their deliberations. As of this moment, 9:40 a.m. Eastern time, the Iranians had not put forward a formal response on whether or not they're going to send a delegation to Islamabad. My sense is that the most likely scenario is that there will be some kind of a resolution that meets the minimal Iranian sort of requests, and that there will be talks. But it's always possible that the United States and Israel just decide to start bombing again. That, however, would come with great risks and likely very great cost to the United States. And the final thing I'll say on this is that the Iranians told me that if Trump and Israel start bombing Iran again, that Iran is going to cut off all diplomatic channels and focus entirely on fighting.
And Marani just posted, let me put this up because he's kind of often an interesting signal of where certain factions are headed. So he says, this is this morning, an hour ago, less than an hour ago, he says everyone should immediately leave the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi, and Kuwait. Sailors on all ships in the Persian Gulf must also prepare to evacuate their ships. This is especially urgent for ships near the Strait of Hormuz, which will be destroyed first. Time is running out. What should we read from that, and how does that fit into what you're understanding about what the Iranian response would be if the U.S. and Israel attack again?
What I'm hearing from Iranian diplomats that are involved with the negotiations is that they actually are open to talking with the United States. I don't think that the preferred Iranian route is to continue the war. I think that Iran is saying what their position is, and that came in the form of public statements from Ghalibaf and others, that they're not going to bow to the diktats of Donald Trump, that they're going to enter it as a nation that fought back against a superpower and Israel, over the course of 6 weeks. But what I think that post is indicative of is the messaging from Iran of what is going to happen if there aren't talks or if Iran is struck. Because what Iran is saying is that they have other cards that they haven't played yet. You could see the Bab el-Mandeb Straits also blockaded by Ansar Allah in Yemen. You could see much wider attacks at oil infrastructure and further military action with Iran's speedboats in the Strait of Hormuz. I think if the United States and Israel do start attacking Iran again, there is great reason to be very concerned if you are a resident of one of those Gulf countries that Professor Morandai is mentioning. I don't think that we're at that stage right now. I think that what he's saying, and I'm not speaking for him, essentially is if this goes the route of continued war, you're going to see a very, very serious Iranian military response that is primarily going to be focused on U.S.-related infrastructure in the Persian Gulf.
And last thing before we get to some of these Trump comments, help me understand who benefits from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because you now have people like President Trump saying, aha, the fact that the Iranians want the strait opened before the talks begin proves that actually it's the Iranians who want it open, and that we, the United States, are comfortable with it being closed. Yet at the same time, Trump says the goal is to open it, and there's there's an asymmetrical relationship to how long each can suffer economically. So what's your sense of how this plays out with both sides blocking the same thing?
I mean, I think this is epic spin on the part of Trump. Let's just break it down into pieces. What the Iranians are saying is that the U.S. has imposed this military blockade. And of course, they've said that this is illegal under international laws and regulations, which is a separate discussion. But this is a micro negotiation that the Iranians are referring to. What they're saying is that they had an agreement on how the ground was going to be set for the next round of talks, and that Trump violated it by going on this rant and rampage where he's threatening again to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages, and says we're going to actually keep this military blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not that the Iranians are coming, crying to the United States, oh, you're hurting us by blockading the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians believe that what they've done in the Strait of Hormuz and forcing the United States to come and impose what they believe is an illegal military blockade is evidence of the strength of their position. They're not asking for this because they're saying, oh, we're losing money. They're saying, if you want to have talks with us, you need to do this. So Trump is sort of, it's an apples to oranges, framing that Trump is engaged in here. Certainly on a strategic immediate level, Iran benefits the most from the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, because there was all this focus about Iran's ballistic missile capacity, and Iran hasn't had to fire a single ballistic missile or launch a single drone over this 2-week period to show that it is able to impact the decision-making process of the United States government and cause widespread panic among the allies of the United States around the world. So from a strategic short to medium term perspective, this benefits the Iranians. On a long-term perspective, if Trump was to essentially abandon ship on the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, and you have some kind of a deal that is fragile, vague, but results in no more bombing happening between Iran and the United States, then it sort of shifts the discussion back to what is Iran going to do about this right now? Because many of the nations that depend on the transit through the Strait of Hormuz are actually allies of Iran. I put this question to a senior Iranian official because I saw Joe Kent, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, who resigned in protest a few weeks ago. He was saying there's this third option for Trump, which is to walk away and essentially just declare victory and let other countries sort out the Strait of Hormuz. It's interesting because it's consistent with Trump's line on this, where he's saying, we don't need this, which actually isn't true, but let's run with it for a second. So let's say that they do that. I put that question to Iranian officials and said, wouldn't this then create a serious problem for Iran if they tighten the economic sanctions? You don't get any substantive unfreezing of your assets. The Strait of Hormuz, Trump essentially says, let Europe figure it out, let China figure it out. And what the Iranian official said is, we've been engaged in a parallel set of discussions with our strategic allies and partners, including some nuclear powers, by which I assume he means China and or Russia, and is saying that we're confident in the alternative arrangements that we've already shared proposals of with our allies. So it's an interesting question. I mean, if Trump were to leave the Strait of Hormuz sort of vague, I don't think that's going to happen, but it could. Then Iran is saying, we're working on alternative structures to address that. I would emphasize two things, though, just in closing on this. One is we have to remember that twice in a year, the United States bombed Iran when it claimed to be engaging in negotiations. We should never, forget that aspect of it. But the other is that Iran has said it's a red line to hand over enriched uranium. The Iranians are saying under no conditions are they going to do that. They're willing to dilute it. They're willing to accept a oversight mechanism of international nuclear inspectors that does appear to have the potential to go beyond the JCPOA, where there were certain sites off limits. I don't know what the Iranians are going to do about that. So, there are issues here that the Iranians have drawn as a red line, and they happen to coincide with what Trump has said are his red lines, that it has to be that we get the dust, as he put it. The Iranians are saying they never made any agreement to do that. So the idea that there's going to be a comprehensive agreement in a matter of hours, I think is highly, highly unlikely. Iran seems to think that there may be some messy resolution that somehow meets its basic minimal standards, and that Trump decides he doesn't want to do this anymore.